Hi, my name is Jeff Mock. I am the Executive Director of the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. Today, today's state legislators from 5 states across the U.S. are sharing the steps that they are taking to better protect against wildlife diseases and thus future pandemics. Each state on the call today has introduced legislation to address the recent increase in infectious diseases originating in animals. Most states on this call are introducing legislation that will more closely regulate the trade and importation of wildlife, while others are introducing different forms of legislation with the common goal of increasing wildlife disease tracking and prevention before they escalate into another pandemic. Represented states today include California, New Hampshire, New York, Oregon, and Washington State. Before diving into policy, I want to take a moment and introduce NCEL. We are the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. It is a nonprofit organization that was created by and for state legislators. We organize a network of over 1,000 environmentally committed state legislators from all 50 states and both parties. NCEL does not lobby for or against legislation. Rather, the organization provides venues and opportunities for lawmakers to share ideas and collaborate on environmental issues. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been organizing and convening legislators who are working to increase protections against the inevitable emergence of future wildlife diseases. It is our hope that through collaboration and sharing lessons learned, legislators can raise awareness about the vital need to increase disease prevention. And by having legislators work together to solve this issue that cuts across state lines, our common defenses against wildlife disease will be stronger and more unified. That's why I am proud to be here today with this group of dedicated legislators working on the cutting edge of state legislation to slow the spread of these diseases and avoid future pandemics. I would like to mention that one of NCEL's primary focuses is on ensuring a healthy, just, and equitable environment for all. Racial equity plays a key role in NCEL's work, and the recent discrimination, attacks, and general hostility towards the Asian American community is unfortunate and unacceptable. Much of this unjust hostility is the product of a misunderstanding of wildlife diseases and the way they are spread. While COVID-19 emerged from China, future pandemics have the very real potential to begin in the United States. This is to say, wildlife diseases are not dependent on a specific region, way of life, or color of skin. They emerge indiscriminately due to the way humans have exploited nature and wildlife. We have also seen during the current pandemic that those facing some of the highest rates of infection and death are communities of color and lower socioeconomic status. Often communities that are left with disproportionately high levels of air pollution due to their proximity to pollutive industries. These are among the many reasons why the work of these 5 legislators is so critical for the future well-being, health, and equity of us all. By introducing policies to prevent the transmission of diseases from wildlife to human populations, these legislators are demonstrating a recognition that the health of the environment, wildlife, and human populations are all interconnected. I'd like to now turn it over to NCEL's Senior Conservation Advisor, Ruth Musgrave, who will provide an overview of wildlife diseases and the current legislative landscape.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you all so much for being here today. This is quite an issue. By this time, exactly a year ago, state legislators, NCEL, and the entire nation were becoming acutely aware of the issue of wildlife disease, or more correctly said, zoonotic disease. That's pathogens that are carried in wild or domestic animals that can infect humans and other animals. COVID-19 has thrown the world into a global pandemic. It's already killed 2.8 million people worldwide, and I think today we'll hit 560,000 people in the US alone, more than all of our major wars combined, with a hugely disproportionate impact on people of color. Estimated costs of the pandemic to the United States alone are over $16 trillion. Every state in the nation has been forced to deal with this issue on some level. All our lives have changed dramatically, and this is a mild pandemic. What we have learned is that this crisis has 3 interconnected legs: public health, wildlife and animal health, and the environment. Unless all three issues are addressed, the crisis will only recur. The concept of One Health recognizes that the health of people is connected to the health of animals and the environment, and it addresses all three issues together. As a matter of fact, one state that is not represented today because our members could not be here is New Jersey, which just passed unanimously Senate Bill 347. It will establish a permanent One Health task force of state agencies, physicians, veterinarians, and scientists, and they will create a plan to promote collaboration among the disciplines to tackle all three parts of this threat of wildlife disease. So first, concerning human health, currently at any given time, 1 billion people worldwide have some form of zoonotic disease, and that doesn't count COVID. 75% of emerging diseases worldwide are zoonotic. COVID is one, of course, but so is HIV, MERS, Ebola, swine flu, bird flu, even the Spanish flu, West Nile hantavirus, as well as insect-carried diseases such as malaria, Lyme disease, Zika, and dengue fever. Humans have virtually no immunity to most of these zoonoses, and as we are witnessing, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color are disproportionately devastated due to the inherent racist and oppressive factors that have driven a lack of public health infrastructure. What about wildlife health, the second leg? Well, now over 1 million species are at risk of extinction, yet wildlife populations continue their catastrophic decline because of exploitation, trade, and habitat loss. In fact, today, wild animals constitute only 4% of the total mass of mammals on Earth. Wildlife species naturally carry thousands of viruses, and they always have. But wildlife is increasingly hunted, poached, traded, sold, and consumed, coming into closer contact with humans and livestock. And wildlife under stress sheds more virus. Live animal markets can be particularly dangerous to humans because of the proximity to other wild animals, livestock, and humans. And these are not just exotic animals. Many amphibians, reptiles, and mammals and other native species carry zoonoses. Finally, what about the environment? We all know the natural world is being degraded at a record pace through deforestation and development, and climate changes are further stressing our ecosystems. Wildlife habitat of all kinds is rapidly disappearing, further stressing wildlife and bringing animals into even closer proximity to humans. In addition, industrialization, lack of infrastructure, and pollution in disadvantaged communities often attracts disease vectors such as mosquitoes and rodents. So how is the United States a part of this crisis? Well, the US is the second largest trader of wildlife and animals in the world, legally importing over 200 million animals a year. On the federal level, the CDC does regulate some species of public health concerns, such as bats, primates, and certain rodents. But by and large, most imported animals are not inspected or regulated. And illegal wildlife trafficking is also a huge issue in the United States. Although we can say 12 states and Washington, D.C. have banned wildlife trafficking in many exotic species. In fact, each of the states represented here today has a ban on intrastate wildlife trafficking. In addition, most of the pet trade and even breeding farms, such as mink farms, are not regulated at all. On the federal level, the USDA tries to monitor and regulate livestock and zoonotic diseases such as swine flu and bird flu, and the Fish and Wildlife Service monitors most endangered species whose trade is regulated under international treaty. But these agencies have limited capacity to coordinate their efforts. Well, states historically have also lacked coordination and communication among themselves about zoonotic risk and response. But by working together, they can better protect public health as well as keep each other informed about zoonotic risks, spillover, and responses. So the American Rescue Plan Act does have some new provisions that provide additional funding to Fish and Wildlife and the USDA, and that will assist states with inspection and enforcement, as well as it provides substantial funding to support all levels of government to increase public health surveillance, testing, epidemiology, and response capability. But states are still largely in charge of regulating their own animal trade and markets and restrictions on imports of wildlife, pet animals, and breeding farms. A number of our members were inspired to introduce legislation this year to ensure that states are empowered to do all they can do to restrict and monitor trade in live animals or products that pose a zoonotic threat. These state efforts that you will hear about today will demonstrate a variety of approaches to stopping the influx and spread of zoonotic diseases of all kinds. The legislators have met with each other and with experts. They've discussed potential language, met with their own agencies, and even occasionally requested legislature-wide briefings on the topic. They are also broadly committed to long-term conservation of their own states' ecosystems and wildlife, as well as their public health capabilities. Now, I would like to introduce California Senator Henry Stern, who has been an inspiration to other state legislators by his early recognition of and action on the threat of zoonotic disease, to discuss more about the value of the states working together and why action is urgently needed. Senator?
Thank you so much, Ruth. And thanks for all your leadership within NCEL, as well as Jeff and the rest of the board. As a board member of this organization, it's inspiring to see the network working, and this emerging coalition around the issue we're talking about today of wildlife trafficking, but on so many other issues. I think NCEL is really emerging as a hub of smart research, of good thinking, of bipartisan and multi-state collaboration. So this is a powerful coalition we've put together here today, and hope it grows. I'm the chair of the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee in California, which means my committee oversees all wildlife issues in California, everything from trafficking and importation to conservation, restoration, a lot of the sort of comprehensive solutions you're talking about today. But frankly, in California, which fancies itself to be a leader on environmental and conservation issues, we have as big of a blind spot as anybody. There is no exceptionalism here. We are not the gold standard. In fact, the amount of wildlife trafficking that's occurring both interstate and internationally into California, by our initial estimates, dwarfs most nations all over the world. What Ruth didn't mention is that this is also big business. There's over a $20 billion industry internationally in wildlife trafficking. And a lot of that industry is here in the United States of America. It does include jurisdictions abroad as well. And it's everything from endangered species to domestic. This is equally threatening to public health on a number of fronts. But the industry behind it makes the politics quite difficult. So I admire the courage of my fellow legislators here today for stepping up and trying to do something about it. Because much of this economy has occurred in the shadows. And frankly, these shadow economies are only dwarfed by the drug trade and by human trafficking. Wildlife trafficking is the third most profitable black market economy on earth. So this is big business, and it's a big threat. And we know we've seen the consequences from a public health perspective, but I also believe this is a national security threat. And if states can start building up their own infrastructure and doing simple steps, requiring private unaccredited zoos or other importers or exporters to make sure their animals don't have a disease before they ship them from one state to another. So if you have a lion on the border of California that you're about to sell northward to Oregon or Washington, that we can't just send a blind ladle, bill of ladling and send it up there and leave it in their hands, that we're going to be doing our diligence and not creating external risks and threats. We're incredibly porous at our ports and our ports of entry. We have incredibly limited enforcement authority. We simply don't have the rangers and the other wildlife law enforcement personnel to get this done. So the American Rescue Plan does hold seeds of hope. And I hope that out of this interstate collaboration that we start to see a national response that puts some of our state-based efforts together in an interstate framework at a national level. And I think the bones of that are there in the rescue plan. So we can get into a little more detail as we go forward here, but I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I guess I'll kick it back over to Jeff to facilitate the remarks from my colleagues here and look at some of the bills.
Thank you, Senator Stern, for that introduction, and thank you, Ruth, for that great background information. That's exactly right. We are at the part in the agenda where we will go to each of the state legislators to speak about their specific bills that they are working on. And so to start, we will go back to you, Senator Stern.
So I'll give you the brief rundown of SB 376. We tried this bill last year, and we've actually been working on this issue for about 3 years here in California. Even before the pandemic, we saw the gaps, and we saw a lot of concerns. Started initially as a concern about endangered species and the impact that wildlife trafficking was having on the mass extinction crisis going on, but we realized it's not just endangered species, it's all kinds of species. So our bill would require anyone importing or exporting wildlife, broadly defined, to ensure that there is no there is no known risk of readily transmissible zoonotic disease from that species for which there is no known cure. It may be that if you have a gorilla in the zoo that has a common cold and you're aware of it, that you can deal with that issue. But as we've seen with this pandemic, disease can not only move from animal to people, but from people back to animals. We've seen outbreaks amongst many of our wildlife here in the state of California. So we're hoping to get this piece of legislation done this year. The lobbying effort was actually quite intense last year, and we expect it to continue. We've seen, especially in the unregulated private zoo market and in some other sectors of the economy, there's a unknown but very significant interest in import-export of wildlife. But I think the gravity of the moment hopefully convinces people that it's worth the vote. So it died in the last night of session last year. But in addition to equipping our Department of Fish and Wildlife with more enforcement authority at our borders and regulating sales more closely, we're also looking at live animal markets and ensuring that there are not sales of both invasive, non-native, endangered, or other potentially risky sales at live animal markets. We know this is not a hugely common practice, but it is occurring, and there have been undercover investigations conducted and other sting operations that have revealed quite a substantial black market in this economy. So we're hoping to get at a few of these different problems at once, and maybe with all your help, we'll get this done. Shining the national spotlight should help us. So I'll kick it back to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Senator Stern. And next up, we will work our way up the West Coast with Oregon, State Representative Ken Helm.
Well, good morning. It's nice to be with everyone this morning. The bill that we have working through our legislature right now is House Bill 3204. And I thought it might be interesting to chart my own progress with this bill for folks, because it's probably indicative of some thought processes that others may have. I've been fortunate to work with a stakeholder group here in Oregon that includes national wildlife protection organizations, conservation organizations, and hunting and fishing organizations on past legislation. This past summer, in preparing for our long session, which we're in the middle of right now, I got this coalition together and said, hey, maybe we should be doing something around wildlife markets and potential wet markets, and see if there's a problem there and what we should do about it. We started our investigation and quickly found out that in terms of live wildlife markets or live markets here in Oregon, we're not finding any. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but we weren't finding any. And we still thought that there was probably something that needed to be done in order to address the zoonotic disease threat. And about that time, NCEL held a forum at which Senator Stern spoke And we also were availed with the excellent talents of Dr. Johnson and Dr. Bunn out of UC Davis, who are nationally known experts on zoonotic disease transfer. And I wanted to thank them now because they've been with us via video in Oregon several times to inform my colleagues of the threat. From there, I came away with two epiphanies after that meeting. One is the next outbreak of a COVID type disease could happen anywhere in the world. It is not destined to come from Southeast Asia. And that bore itself out right here in Oregon this past year as we had outbreaks of COVID in at least one of our mink farms here. And as I understand it, the transmission went back from human to mink and back. That's what happened in Denmark as well, tremendously alarming. So that proved that we could have an indigenous problem here in Oregon. The other epiphany was caused by the knowledge that Senator Stern was hopefully going to be successful in California with their efforts to clamp down on the importation of wildlife species. What that means is if California's ports become closed or perceived to be difficult for importation, then the importers are just going to move up the West Coast to Portland and Seattle. That was very motivating to me. And as we did our due diligence and talked to our state agencies and the federal agencies that we think are in the lead of protecting us against wild animals and their diseases that come in to our ports, I found what Senator Stern described, which is it is Swiss cheese out there. Good intentions, federal agencies that have the charge, but they don't have the budget or the person power to get the job done. And neither did our state agencies. The mandate was not rigorous enough, and they are not staffed or funded to do so. So we are not quite in the evolution of legislation here in Oregon, having it come just the first time this session to consider a ban. But we put in place recommendations that, as Ruth mentioned, are similar to other states, which include a requirement that the relevant state agencies in this state become coordinated around the information and notification of potential problems with wildlife diseases, that our Department of Fish and Wildlife create a list based on existing list and further research about potential species of concern and threats, and that over time we move toward a situation in which we can heavily restrict or ban the importation of those species. So we are very much moving toward the One Health model, and this is the first step. I have high hopes that House Bill 3204 will move out of committee tomorrow on the House side, and we'll go down to our Ways and Means Committee, get funded, and then we'll have the chance to vote on it this session. Once again, thanks to NCEL for facilitating all of this, because I think it has the possibility of very much helping Oregon. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative. And next up, we will finish off the West Coast with Washington State Senator Jesse Solomon.
Thank you, appreciate it. So my name is Jesse Solomon. I represent North King County and South Snohomish County. So that's the North Seattle and the sort of Seattle surrounding suburbs. I'm also the vice chair of Natural Resources, Agriculture, Water, and State Parks, and have always been passionate about preserving the environment. And I also think that the One Health model is critical to show that we don't live in separation from the rest of the planet, that we live in connection to it. And when we don't realize that, we hurt other creatures and we hurt ourselves. And I think this pandemic, unfortunately, is putting that in stark relief. Part of what I'm trying to do here in Washington State is to empower leaders who are smarter than I am and know more about this topic. And I'll explain how we get there. The problem that I'm trying to address is, we have a dramatic increase in shipping containers, 1 billion containers worldwide through international trade. There's very little searching of those containers, so it's pretty easy to smuggle wildlife and timber, illegal timber, and it's leading to a dramatic increase in wildlife trafficking and poaching. So the solution that I'm working on comes from the University of Washington, led by Professor Samuel Wasser, in creating a program for Center for Environmental Forensic Science, which essentially is knitting together multidisciplinary teams to bring together law enforcement, biologists, geneticists, mechanical engineering professors, statisticians, and members from other disciplines to go to the source, meaning stop some of the trafficking at the source, find a way to dramatically increase contraband detection, gather evidence, trace financial transactions that international traffickers have conducted to move their products, including money laundering, linking poaching, trafficking to international organized crime, groups who engage in a wide variety of the worst crimes, and work with law enforcement to ensure prosecutions abroad by linking criminals to multiple crimes, which makes it difficult for corrupt officials to protect them and helps prosecutors appreciate the severity of the criminal activity. And what I'm trying to do is, right now I have $1 million in the Senate budget to help jumpstart this program at the University of Washington. So a lot of expertise is out there, right? But this is about bringing together, you have disciplines in silos that don't talk to each other that really could work together to solve a real world problem. So those, I think those are two sort of revolutionary ideas. So for example, you know, in terms of what we can expect out of this, they've helped so far develop what's called a high throughput method of searching cargo using detection dogs to search shipping containers at ports by vacuuming air from the shipping container vents. So rather than having to open every container and go through it by hand, that way you dramatically increase the searches. And originally this was done for timber. Like you can use, I don't know, the olfactory products, measuring products. That was developed using from a mechanical engineer at UW. The high throughput method is again focused right now on illegal timber sales. Problem with the timber sales, the problem with the illegal timber is it fragments habitat and then exposes people to these new zoonotic diseases, which easily spreads around the world. So if you can go after the illegal activity, you sort of by default help stop the zoonotic disease spread. And then other aspects of it is it traces the DNA. So you can find elephant tusks in 2 different parts of the world. And now we can say, oh, they come from the same elephant. It's related to these elephants that live here. So we know exactly where the source is. And again, it creates connections, evidentiary connections that help prosecute these poachers for more serious crimes than related to actual trafficking and not only poaching. So thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Senator. And we will be opening up for questions at the end. But first we will, or next we will go to New York Assembly Member Joanne Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, first I want to thank NCEL for, you know, its work bringing people together with experts around the country to highlight these emerging issues, because it was in one of those programs that I learned about the increasing threat of wildlife diseases to humans. So I want to thank my colleagues who are on this call and NCEL and the experts that they've been working with, who've really been helpful to me in crafting my bill, which is very similar to that of Senator Stern and Senator Helm. You know, my bill would, which is A2054, would restrict the importation of wildlife to the state of New York. And so it's obviously it's going to be certain wildlife. The goal, of course, is to improve the awareness of these practices and reduce the importation of wildlife that could further zoonotic transfer between wildlife and humans, and hopefully stop the pandemic and a next pandemic. We're doing that, what I would call, from my Catholic school upbringing, sort of removing the near occasion of sin. If we are not importing the kinds of wildlife that are of concern, that are capable of zoonotic transfer, we'll be able to eliminate that from happening. It also tightly regulates the live animal markets in New York by requiring regulations, very strict regulations with regard to the storing and sale of animals for those live animal markets. You know, Tom Friedman in the New York Times recently wrote an article that caught my eye, and it was called "1 Year Later, We Still Have No Plan to Prevent the Next Pandemic." And he talked about a program and an expert, Steve Osofsky from Cornell, which is in upstate New York, who's a wildlife veterinarian, who I thought poetically talked about, you know, how the health of wildlife, the health of our ecosystems, and our own health are inextricably linked. And what I thought was most poetic is he said that through our own human behaviors, we're inviting the viruses into humanity's living room. And I thought that that was a really great way of characterizing this problem, which I think the public is less aware of. So one of the things we are working at in New York is increasing public awareness of this through this bill and through other bills that colleagues of mine have passed. You know, one of my colleagues has really focused on, for example, tick-borne diseases such as Lyme and others, and has an awareness campaign, which is #GetTicked-Off. And that's Assemblymember Dee Dee Barrett, who I know has been involved with NCEL as well. But we have that Swiss cheese effect here as well. And so we've been, you know, it's easy to look at the ticks, it's easy to look at this animal or that animal, but you know, what we're trying to accomplish with this bill is something that is more comprehensive and can really get at the issues before they come to New York and before they are able to spread. Obviously, we have the same importation problems that a lot of states have. We also have a lot of cultural groups, for example, that will be concerned about some of the aspects of this bill, perhaps, but it's something we're working on. For the most part, I think it is actually not going to be an issue, a real issue. So we're going to be working on educating as well. And I am, at this juncture, reaching out to the agencies and my colleagues who chair the relevant committees. The bill does require that the Department of Environmental Conservation engage with the Department of Health and the Department of Agriculture in the creation of regulations and the implementation of the statute. And so that's something that I'm going to be working closely with my colleagues on to ensure that we make it clear that this really has to be a comprehensive, reasonable, enforceable, and implementable bill that would improve the health and equity in New York State, and doing that in an intersectional way. I think we're learning about intersectionality in a lot of phases of our society, and I think it's really important in this area as well. And that's what I've been doing, and I'm really looking forward to the questions and to learning more from my colleagues and our experts. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Assembly Member. And then our last legislator speaking today before we get to questions will be New Hampshire State Senator David Waters.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks to NCL and to my colleagues in bringing this important group of bills together. My bill is Senate Bill 146, Part 3, and it has passed the Senate, and so it's on to the House at this point. And it passed because New Hampshire recognized it has to be prepared for zoonotic disease prevention, for public health, and for the safety of our food supply. My previous work on wildlife trafficking really showed that states do have to act individually. I think that there is often a mistaken impression that the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species takes care of this, and that there may be already federal Department of Agriculture regulation of markets. And the fact is that in the states, that's just not the case. And so we do need to act, and we do need to act together. I think there's also been a lot of experience with food markets in New Hampshire, where we've recognized, because of previous incidents, that we have to be very careful about regulating our food markets to keep the food supply safe. And so Senate Bill 146 offers three things. First, it puts into state statute findings about the danger of zoonotic disease transmission, and also the need to be sure that we don't have transmission through live animal markets. And so first off, then secondly, what it does in terms of actions is that it requires, it forbids the importation of wildlife species that are known to be transmitters of zoonotic diseases, and then has the Fish and Game Department working with the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services to monitor the appearance and any information that comes available about potential threats, and then has the ability to recommend legislation, regulation, and if necessary, emergency action from executive order by the governor to respond to such threats. The other action that it takes is related to food markets, and it does several things there. It says that you can't offer for sale at a market a live animal that is a taxon known to be responsible for zoonotic disease transmission or disease, as determined by the Director of Fish and Game. And then wildlife species that are identified as known or likely carriers of such diseases shall not be caged, handled, or transported with livestock or domestic animals, and shall not be sold in spaces near livestock or domestic animals. And then it also then says that any wildlife species that are identified as known or likely carriers of zoonotic diseases shall not be permitted to be sold in a live animal market or a live wildlife market. And then finally, it does reference wildlife covered by federal statutes as on wildlife trafficking, but then says specifically that no bat, rodent, or primate species shall be sold in live animal markets in the state. So this is what we need to do to prepare to make sure the people of New Hampshire are safe. But as has been mentioned, we really do need to act with other states, because this is an issue that does not know state boundaries. Well, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you all for presenting today. We are going to now end the Facebook live stream. So we really appreciate all of you that joined us today on Facebook, and please do follow us on Facebook so you can keep updated on our information. And then we're going to move to taking questions from our legislators. So thank you. Goodbye, Facebook. And now for those media who are on, if you would like to ask any questions, we do ask that you identify yourself and your media outlet, as well as to whom you might be addressing the question. So do we have any questions from media?
I think a lot of the media might have been on Facebook instead of the Zoom link. So we might get written questions later. Jeff, would it be all right for me to pose the question that you posed this morning and get reactions from our legislators?
Absolutely.
Jeff asked this morning about whether things would be different if it's eventually found out that COVID-19 was just made up in a lab and was not the product of a bat. Would that change anything? I had my own answer, but love to hear from you all.
Well, I'm glad to say that, whatever we find out about COVID-19, we know that that such diseases have been transmitted from wildlife before. We got a little bit lucky with SARS maybe, and some others, but we better be prepared.
Yeah, I would add it really doesn't change our thinking much. I mean, we know the threat is still immense, as Senator Waters mentioned, and frankly, the incursion into wildlands and into habitats from increased development and other pressures is going to yield new viruses going forward in the future. So I don't think it would change our analysis, but we're certainly acutely aware of that ongoing dispute to the origins of this disease. We do know that it does occur, though, among bat and other avian populations, and is a derivative of the SARS virus. So there is, regardless of the exact place it started, there is still an animal origin here.
Oh, let me answer real quick, and then I have to go to our floor session for the day. A fun, if not scary, explanation of zoonotic disease threat came from John Oliver not too long ago. And if you search that, you'll be treated to 20 minutes of his very pointed information and humor. But he very, very wisely looked back at some television footage of experts commenting on SARS when it occurred. And they predicted then that there would be a worse outbreak. Mm-hmm. And he admonished us to remember how we feel right now as we move out of this pandemic, because the experts will tell us that a worse pandemic in terms of COVID virus could be on its way. It's not remote. It's very much nearer than we would like to think. And being a short-sighted species ourselves, we need to keep our eye on the ball. I have enjoyed being here today. I wish you all luck with your legislation. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When the outbreak happened in March, I read a book called, I think it was called Outbreak, and it detailed how Ebola jumped from simian species, I guess gorillas, to humans, and also talked about HIV. It's not quite as clear exactly when and how, but that happened, but it was pretty clearly from similar simian species. So as we have more and more contact with different parts of the forests and wildlife, whether or not COVID specifically is lab created, which I think is a crazy notion, but doesn't really change the fact that we are playing with fire and need to change our environmental practices and our public health practices, but also look at this as a problem of our impact on the environment. And so, yeah,
I agree. And it's one of the reasons why in my communications I am not limiting the references to the current pandemic to COVID, because there's just too much politics associated with that, including this notion about it being created in a laboratory, because we know it's a much bigger picture, and we need to kind of remove the sort of politics from it as much as possible, because that's just going to get in the way. And so I've been talking about other diseases and pandemics as well.
All right, thank you for those thoughtful answers. We'll open it up to any further questions. And if there are none, then we will thank everyone for your involvement today. Thank you for media that joined us. Thank you for legislators for working on this important issue and for presenting today. And thank you to the NCEL team for pulling all this together. Really appreciate it, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.